Apple is currently spying on 1.2 billion people, but this wasn't always the case. Apple was famous for its security. They prided themselves on guarding their users' privacy and even fought the FBI to keep their devices secure. But recently, Apple's been going down a dark path. They've sold out their customers to the Chinese government, made their phones into 24/7 listening devices, and now they're even threatening to scan people's personal photos. So what happened here? Is it true that iPhones really spy on you? And if so, why did Apple become what they had fought so hard against in the past? Well, to answer this, we need to go back to the start. Apple was always priding itself on the state-of-the-art data encryption technology that was built into their products, as privacy and security was one of their top priorities. This focus on security comes in the form of specialized software being implemented on their cloud servers, as well as firmware physically embedded in their phones and other devices. And for years, Apple kept up this reputation. In fact, former Apple CEO Steve Jobs was an outspoken advocate for privacy, and he made sure that the products they were making matched his rhetoric. When Jobs spoke about privacy in 2010, he defined the subject as, quote, meaning people know what they're signing up for in plain English and repeatedly. And along with these comments came a strict set of rules for Apple's data collection and how they use it. Jobs' policy was to, quote, let them know precisely what you're going to do with their data. But unfortunately, the difference between him and the tech giants of today was that Jobs actually stood by what he said about privacy.
We have rejected a lot of apps that want to take a lot of your personal data and suck it up into the cloud.
An example of this was when Apple got challenged in 2010 for how they were collecting user data and how they made positive changes after facing the criticism. The company's new UDID, or Unique Device Identifier program, came under fire for being an unblockable form of tracking. And once Apple figured out people were unhappy with the system, they removed it from their OS and replaced it with an easily blockable downsized version. It wasn't really great that they had implemented such a concept in the first place, but it still showed that they were willing to give some leeway in putting privacy first. Apple's focus on privacy was so ingrained into the company's mindset that they actually used to refuse cooperating with law enforcement when agencies asked them to hand over data from potential criminals. Over the years, Apple has essentially been in a war with multiple governments for years over their evidence handover policies. Federal organizations like the FBI have been requesting a backdoor into all Apple products for a long time now, and these legal troubles came to a head in early 2016 when the FBI wanted access to an alleged mass shooter's iPhone for details on the crime. But while the government insisted that this would be a one-off arrangement, allowing it would have opened the floodgates to a whole host of security issues. And so Apple ended up refusing the FBI's demands, and the company's CEO Tim Cook made a statement where he elaborated on Apple's views on privacy and the feds. Quote, the government is asking Apple to hack our own users and undermine decades of security advancements that protect our customers. It would be wrong for the government to force us to build a backdoor into our products. Because of this, the FBI later withdrew their request, and it seemed like Apple had won for now. At least it seemed that way, because the FBI did eventually unlock the shooter's iPhone that started the whole ordeal. And even though there was nothing inside that was relevant to the case, it begged the question, if they could unlock the phone in question anyway, why did they need such a backdoor into all iPhones? Some, like Edward Snowden, claim that this was a ploy to set up government mass surveillance. But with Apple standing their ground, it did seem like they were very set in their ideals. Surely nothing would make them falter now, right? Well, Apple's long history of securing their users' security was all about to come to an end, as they eventually started bending to the common data practices employed by all other big tech companies. Relative to their Android competition, Apple would always keep their users' data much more under wraps than the competition. Part of the reason Apple was much tighter with security relative to Google is because of the latter outsourcing much of their technologies to other companies, like they do with Android. I mean, just looking at the disaster of the Pixel phone, it's not hard to see why Google uses this strategy. Apple is nearly the complete opposite, as they work almost exclusively within their own brand of technology and market the devices exclusively as such. And it's not hard to see why Apple does this either, as the company has always had the reputation of being at the forefront of technological innovation, especially in regards to privacy. Tim Cook, Apple's CEO, has even gone on record saying that Apple believes that privacy is a fundamental human right.
Privacy to us is a human right. It's a civil liberty.
Although recently, it seems like Apple is changing its definition of privacy, and this downward spiral really began in 2017, when Apple let the Chinese government start to pick and choose what was put on the App Store. In July of that year, Apple received an order from the Chinese government to remove all brands of VPNs from the App Store, because many Chinese citizens use VPNs to bypass the quote, Great Chinese Firewall, a digital iron curtain which blocks access to a huge selection of outside websites, and this system is the cornerstone of Chinese internet censorship.
Known as the Great Firewall of China, this censorship engine allows the Chinese government to regulate the internet and protect its citizens from dangerous content, or at least that's what they claim.
it is their greatest tool for their authoritarian regime. Because if you used a VPN in China, it would mean that you're able to bypass at least some of the firewall's restrictions. Knowing this, it's no surprise why the Chinese government doesn't want anyone using a VPN, and so it's no surprise that they demanded Apple remove all of them from the App Store. And surprisingly, Apple actually caved into China's orders. In a complete reversal of what their CEO Tim Cook said in the past, Apple cut off an estimated 130 million Chinese users' access to banned websites by removing VPNs. These banned websites included Google, YouTube, Facebook, Reddit, and a whole host of others. And so Apple's decision made clear that privacy was no longer the value that Apple regarded so highly. Now, like all other companies, privacy is only something that the company can grandstand on. Because even after doing this, Apple still makes a point to market themselves as the defenders of privacy, despite it clearly now just being a marketing ploy. The influence of the Chinese government has taken precedent over the privacy of Apple's customers, and the company has been quick to appease other demands from the CCP as well, like in 2016 when they banned the New York Times app from their store at the request of the Chinese government. And just a year later, the CCP passed a law that, quote, personal information and important data must be stored in China, a legislation that Apple obviously complied with, meaning that all data from Chinese iPhone users would now have their data stored in the government-managed facilities instead of their own company servers. But the question remains, why did Apple fold so quickly to China after they just won a major battle with the US government only a year earlier? Well, the simple truth is that Apple can't afford to challenge the CCP in any way. For starters, it's estimated that over 90% of Apple's production line is made in China. They rely on Chinese sweatshops to make huge profits, and considering that Apple leans more towards hardware than software, any disruption to their sweatshops would have catastrophic effects for the company. In addition, the Chinese government is all too happy to put sanctions on any foreign company if they step out of line, and the company being sanctioned has no choice when dealing with China. They must fall in line or they are banned from the country. And so as a result of this would serve to be the first major hit to Apple's reputation concerning their privacy. But it wouldn't stop there, because in the years following this, Apple's actions would only get more and more sinister. As it turns out, Apple's privacy infringements aren't strictly limited to China. The company's mindset towards their Western consumers has been to reap the benefits of a good reputation on privacy, all while having other organizations get their hands dirty for them. Although Apple doesn't directly harvest personal user data, they do turn a blind eye to other companies doing this through Apple's own platforms. Tons of applications on Apple's store collect personal information and they get paid handsomely for allowing this. And this seems kind of normal, but Apple itself actually collects some of the data themselves, although they don't classify this as personal, as they insist that this information is not corroborated with identifying factors, whatever the hell that means. And this makes the following statement from Tim Cook all the more confusing. Quote, stockpiles of personal data serve only to enrich the companies that collect them. Apple relies on the public facade that they don't harvest data, even when that notion is demonstrably false. Just because the data isn't tied to individual users, Apple is still able to easily profit from all of this. Apple has been raking in money from companies specializing in data collection for years. For example, Safari has been routing all of their internet searches through Google by default, which comes from a massive deal made in 2018 that earned Apple $9 billion. And what's important here is that all these searches funnel data into Google's gargantuan and immensely unprivate data stockpile, all while Apple profits from it while keeping their nose clean. And this data harvesting scenario is true for all the apps hosted on Apple's store. If they wanted, Apple could implement much stricter rules on collecting personal information through the App Store, but instead they let all of this slide for a profit. However, this is nothing compared to what Apple has been doing over the last couple of years. You see, one of the worst things that Apple has been doing in regards to personal privacy lies at the very center of how the data industry works. Some of the largest tech companies in the world have been founded almost entirely on the raw value of data, and a vast quantity of this information is coming from smartphones. Along with the personal data stored on these phones, the device will always track your location and ping it to cellular towers at all time, which is extremely valuable information that many organizations will pay very good money for, and this problem now applies to everyone. It's called mass surveillance for a reason. You see, it doesn't matter if someone turns their GPS off either, since these factors will paint a very clear picture of where the phone is and has been, and a phone's location is nearly always at the same location as the owner, meaning this essentially acts as a location broadcasting beacon.
Every smartphone, every phone at all, is constantly connected to the nearest cellular tower. Every phone, even when the screen is off, you think it's doing nothing, you can't see it because radio frequency emissions are invisible, it's screaming in the air, saying, here I am, here I am.
And so Apple is playing a very active role in a system that is constantly tracking and recording the location of every one of their users. all while they boast about how concerned they are with privacy. But however totalitarian the system feels, it pales in comparison to what information that smartphone apps are gathering. Apps on iOS as well as Android are constantly communicating back and forth with third-party companies. For example, simply having a Facebook account means that you've given it permission to track every action you make while using the app. And we all know this, but the surveillance goes way beyond just this, as your IP, the ads that you click on, info about your device, and info about your browser are all being tracked. This isn't even a complete list. Data harvesting is a whole rabbit hole that goes way further than you could even imagine. And this isn't just limited to Facebook, since pretty much every app has their own brand of how they collect user information. That's where the money is behind these apps. And this creates an unimaginably complicated web of digital connections. And your phone is facilitating this 24/7, all while Apple turns a blind eye. Sure, they can let you change specific permissions, but at no point do they show the amount of personal data your phone is sucking away from you. Neither do they allow you to interact with it in any real way. In fact, most apps try to make viewing this as opaque as possible. So if you want to use communication apps like Facebook's Messenger system or any of the others, you have to let them harvest your data, and this is all permitted by Apple. But the most awful thing about this is that the whole system is founded on the basis that humanity has given their permission for all of this, even though nobody really knows any of this. I mean, everyone clicks yes on a 100+ page legal agreement, which is usually a document specifically designed to be as lengthy as possible, or is that someone doesn't feel like reading any of it. The entire contract is 7,300 words long, only 200 less than how many are used in the Bill of Rights. And all of this is done to essentially provide an illusion that people have simply handed over their data willingly. But with how necessary it is to be online, it's absurd that privacy is the tax for using digital media, and this illusion has given Apple and all the other major tech companies full access to everyone's private lives. And it's all completely legal, the government has seen to that, and when people like Edward Snowden uncovered this, they were then banished from the country. As Snowden said in his interview on Joe Rogan, the scandal isn't how they broke the law, the scandal is that they don't have to break the law. The erosion of people's privacy has been a gradual process since the early 20th century. It has been slowly built law by law and now bite by bite. Because today, we're now complacent with mass surveillance, and in just the last year, Apple has made this problem even worse. They have twisted the knife in what was left of privacy in the digital age. Because in 2021, Apple announced that they would be introducing a new system to combat the sexual abuse of children. And at first this seems great. However, what's the cost of this? Because the company now claims that they are going to monitor the photos on everyone's iPhones, all to purely protect children, of course. But given Apple's fondness for child labor, it's a little hard to believe. Coin NeuralHash. This system was implemented by Apple to reduce digital contraband on the iCloud. The premise of NeuralHash was that it would automatically scan images on your iCloud account and report it to authorities if enough content was found that matched a database of illegal images. Now, it's pretty safe to say that these new features really have nothing to do with actually protecting children, and are pretty much entirely about monitoring people and surveying their photos.
Anyone that has children, your love of children, and maybe even if you don't have children, your love of children is so powerful and so strong that you would almost accept anything to keep your children safe. You would do anything. Do you think it's a coincidence that this is the way that these companies that are dependent on data, dependent on being able to access your information, dependent, of course, in the case of Apple, it's hardware, but it don't hurt them to have access. And then remember, they operate in conjunction with government, and some people believe that relationships between big tech and government goes deeper than anyone would sensibly speculate on publicly.
And for a company like Apple, who apparently considers privacy, quote, a fundamental human right, a system like this certainly appears out of left field. And so Apple consumers took massive issue with this. This came in the form of many complaints on forums, as well as an open letter addressed to Apple written by dozens of organizations like cybersecurity firms, VPNs, and privacy networks, as well as many other tech companies. In the letter, they stated that Apple has built themselves a backdoor that undermines the fundamental privacy expectations that many users just expect with Apple products. Security experts also say that because the system would work on the device itself, it introduces a backdoor despite what Apple says. Another major problem is that Apple's NeuralHash has easily exploitable technical weaknesses by design. For example, the fact that the system can be reprogrammed to scan for more than what is intended for is a serious security risk. What's more is that the government also decides what is considered an infraction. If they wanted to, the government could demand that system to look for other images such as terrorism, political dissidents, green frogs, and pretty much anything else you can think of. And considering Apple's previous dirty deals with China, it's not a huge leap to see them implementing this technology in such a way. With this kind of system, it's possible that simply having pictures stored on your phone that the CCP doesn't like could become a trackable crime. In the end, NeuralHash would give anyone who holds control over it an unprecedented degree of access into people's private lives. Apple has delayed the system's implementation, although it's still planned for an eventual release. These changes are just yet another notch on how Apple has been undermining digital security. But if you've been paying attention to the news and media, the company is still publicly lauded as the beacon of privacy. And part of the reason for this is because in 2021, Apple introduced a system in iOS 14.5 that allowed users to remove consent for ad services and analytics from whatever app they want. It's called App Tracking Transparency, otherwise known as the ATT system, which forces apps to ask for consent before harvesting some forms of data. And this does seem like a really good thing. It limits applications like TikTok's data mining operations, since people are actually being asked whether they want to be tracked or not. And shockingly, most people don't like having their privacy invaded, as 62% of users opted out. But unfortunately, this problem isn't the return of the old privacy-conscious Apple that most viewed them as, since there are multiple financial reasons that they allowed this option in the first place. The first of which being that it hurts their competitors more than it hurts Apple. When the feature was released in April of 2021, the ATT was slowly adopted as more and more people updated to the new iOS, and within just 6 months, it was already damaging the companies relying on data collection to make a profit. For example, in October, this was responsible for Meta's revenue stagnating. I mean, Apple single-handedly put a cap on Meta's growth by limiting their most important resource data, and this meant Zuckerberg had less money to give to advertisers, meaning they in turn were investing much less into advertising with Meta. And this is great when it comes to competition like Spotify or Google. Apple of course also relies on data, but a vast portion of their revenue is tied into their physical product, so the change hasn't hit Apple nearly as hard as it did with the other companies. Furthermore, Apple hasn't put the same sorts of information collection limits on their own apps. Instead, they ask users if they want to opt in to personalized ads. Other companies get the much more threatening word of tracking in their notification. Apple's also been running ads warning users about the security risks from other apps, but of course there's never mention of their own data harvesting systems. And whilst this might seem good on the surface, the Apple of today is a far cry from what the company was only 10 years ago. The policies they've introduced on data harvesting, smartphone tracking, and their appeasement of the CCP have only reaffirmed this. And on top of all of these compounding issues, the threatening release of NeuralHash is still likely to happen whether users like it or not. The only question that remains is what will they try to get away with next? Stories like these are always buried behind the surface because big tech companies like Apple don't want to promote the truth, causing these important topics to be covered up. Because of this, independent media is more important than ever, which is why I want to talk to you about today's sponsor, the Epoch Times. The Epoch Times brings you breaking US and world news on all your devices, and original Epoch TV programs like Crossroads, The Larry Elder Show, Facts Matter, American Thought Leaders, and award-winning documentaries. But why should you trust the Epoch Times? For one, they're unbiased. They report important news that other media ignore. They focus on clear, fact-based journalism without spin or any hidden agendas. Secondly, they're truthful. These folks tell the truth, and I really mean that, because we don't just take on any old sponsor. If the New York Times reached out, we wouldn't take their money. And number three, they're factual. They just report the facts and trust their discerning readers, that's you, to arrive at your own conclusions. And the Epoch Times is offering a free printed copy of this special report that deep dives into the factors causing our current recession. And luckily, they've got a special offer for all of you. You can get 2 months of the Epoch Times on any device and the special report on the recession for just $1. So go to epochtimes.com/moon and subscribe, or click the link in the description below. If you want to see some more documentaries that are more controversial, videos that I can't post publicly on YouTube, click the join button here or click the link in the description below if you don't see the join button. And by doing this, you'll become a YouTube member, where you'll have access to the videos that have no filter and go into controversial topics that YouTube doesn't like. Already we have a deep dive on the story of Ted Kaczynski and his manifesto, and another video analyzing Mr. Robot as it documents the collapse of modern society. And you can watch both of these videos when you join right now. And soon we're going to be releasing another video on the man who exposed the gay frogs. And not only will you have access to these exclusive videos, but you'll also become a member of my private Discord server, all for just $5.99 a month. So sign up today by clicking that join button below or click the link in the description below.